It's not every day that I would go and get to have a chat with someone that I've recently talked about in one of my videos. So it is a true pleasure to have a special guest star with me. So, dude, may you please introduce yourself to the audience?
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. I'm Garrett Gilchrist. I'm a filmmaker, writer, artist, and animator. I'm a little sunburnt right now, but I edited The Thief and the Cobbler Recobbled Cut from 2007 to 2013. And as you've probably seen, Matt has just done a YouTube series about the history of this film, and I thought I'd come on and say a few things. Matt sent me some questions, and let's talk about The Thief and the Cobbler for a while.
Okay, so with that said, let's go and get this one started. And my first question I would like to know is that you could possibly be the biggest fan of animator Richard Williams. So I think it would make sense to start this off by asking, what is it that made you such a huge fan of Richard Williams in the first place?
In 1989-1990, I was a kid and I loved Roger Rabbit. It's not a film that's entirely appropriate for an 8-year-old, but I was sleeping on Roger Rabbit bed sheets. I had toys and slippers, and this Comic Scene magazine where the animator behind Roger Rabbit said he spent 23 years trying to make the best animated film that's ever been made, and that he couldn't show anything from it because he'd been ripped off before. There were always a lot of projects announced in that magazine that never actually got made. When I was about 14, though, I saw the trailer for Arabian Night in theaters, and it just looked like a bad Aladdin ripoff. But when I got home, it clicked in my head. That was from the animator of Who Framed Roger Rabbit. So that was his great masterpiece, and something had just gone horribly wrong. I was about 17 when I got the internet at home, and I looked the movie up, and I started to learn about what had happened to it. There were articles about this great movie that Richard was making, and how he lost it, how it got ruined by Fred Calvert. I got in touch with a man named Eddie Bowers, who had made this website, and he sent me a VHS tape, which was 6 hours in SLP quality, very low quality, but it had all the versions of the movie on it and documentaries about Richard Williams. This was 1998. So I had this night where I watched the work print in very low quality and these Fred Calvert versions like The Princess and the Cobbler, and at the end of it I was captivated. I was crying, I think, because the work print is very incomplete and the Calvert versions are very incomplete, but if you watch them both together, it filled in a lot of blanks. The one had a lot that the other was missing. I was up all night on a school night. I barely slept because I just watched this great animated film, but it didn't exist. It only existed in your head if you'd watched these incomplete versions of the movie. So that planted the idea for the Recobbled Cut, because I was trying to figure out how I could show these people this movie that didn't exist, but it was 8 years before I could really do that.
Okay. Now, my next question I would like to ask is going to be a little bit similar to the first one, but this is regarding one of Richard Williams' projects. In fact, this was often considered as his passion project, The Thief and the Cobbler, and you seem to be heavily associated the most with The Thief and the Cobbler, more so than any other project that Richard Williams has done. So I would like to ask, why is it that you are so fascinated with The Thief and the Cobbler specifically?
To me, it's not just the story of a film. It's the story of an entire life. It's the story of a temperamental genius who tried to make the greatest animated film he could and failed because of the realities of the film business. It's a film that is a living, breathing character in and of itself. It's a strange and eccentric movie that's unlike anything else ever made, and that reflects the personality of its creator, who wasn't like any other animator. Richard had a way of talking about this film that made it seem uniquely magical. He exaggerated, like P.T. Barnum saying he wanted to be the next Walt Disney and make the best animated movie he possibly could, no matter how long it took. People think that Dick didn't storyboard the film at all until 1989 or 1990, but the Nasruddin film was storyboarded in full in the 70s, and so was anything they were working on afterward. When The Thief was a side project, they didn't need to be producing new storyboards all the time. Dick got a lot of use out of the old Nasruddin storyboards and the early layouts, though they weren't the sort of thing he'd show outsiders. By 1990, most of these storyboards and layouts were old and embarrassing, and Dick was more and more secretive about it all. Richard knew what he was doing, but people who were gossiping about him hadn't seen any of the planning for the past 2.5 decades. To them, it was all just coming out of Dick's head unplanned. But the script was in place, with scene numbers and all that, at least 10 years before production started. By the 1989-1990 production, he needed and could create better storyboards. But up till that point, with the film always being a side project that hadn't been properly funded, the old boards had been enough. Famously, he did all the new storyboards for the final work print in a very short period of time, and they're fantastic. They show that he really was a master at that point. Part of what Dick was doing also was reanimating scenes that had been animated in the 70s and 80s when he and his staff weren't as good as they were in 1990. So there was always gossip around town that Dick's lying to you. He animated that scene in 1973. Well, a lot of the old stuff turned out to be unusable because the standards for an animated film were much higher in 1990. Roger Rabbit is partly to thank for that. Richard had always used the movie as a sort of showpiece to convince people he was great, almost a con artist's hustle. His work was often amazing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but by that point in 1989, he really was the old master he'd been pretending to be before, and most of the old stuff needed to be reanimated. Richard had a bad reputation all those years because he demanded classic Disney quality, and he wasn't Disney. In the 60s and 70s, the quality of animation that you'd expect outside of Disney was very low. The artists weren't trained and weren't ready to do that kind of work, and the old guys who could do it were dying off. So he got the old guys to train the young guys, and Disney did that too. That's why the 80s and 90s Disney's films are so amazing, because the older animators trained the young animators who were raring to go, and Dick's studio was a big part of that movement. Richard was obsessed with this movie, and when it was taken away from him, he lost his life's work, and he didn't talk about it for 20 years. Now he's known as the master animator, the animator's animator. He's written the Animator's Survival Kit, which is now the textbook for any animator. It's the best book ever written on animation, and his animation masterclasses were huge events, always sold out. People who took them became teachers themselves. A lot of the great animators today, they owe a lot to Richard, but people had never seen his masterpiece. You couldn't rent or buy or watch The Thief and the Cobbler. It didn't exist as it was meant to be seen. So that's why I spent years of my life making this version, so that people could see the movie.
Now, let's go and talk about what could possibly be your most famous project that you have done, The Thief and the Cobbler, the Recobbled Cut, which is often credited to be the most famous fan edit ever created for a movie. And with the Recobbled Cut, right now, it is pretty much the closest thing that the public can ever find to get Richard Williams' original vision of the movie. So I would like to know, what is it that made you decide to go and create the Recobbled Cut?
People were asking at this forum, okay, we have the digital tools now. We can edit together a movie any way we want and make a DVD and upload it to the internet. This was all new then. So they were asking, if you could edit any movie, what would it be? Well, there's Little Shop of Horrors, Superman 2, but I said nobody has ever heard of this movie, The Thief and the Cobbler. Only animators have heard of it, but trust me, no movie has ever gotten ruined like this movie got ruined. And somebody should really take the editing tools that we have today and edit that movie together the way it's supposed to be. Well, somebody that I knew there messaged me saying, hey, I worked on The Thief and the Cobbler. Somebody should put that movie back together, and I think it should be you. So here's some rare footage that nobody's seen before, and get to it. So That was a coincidence, and I took it as a sign. This was January 2006, and I was always kind of miserable in Los Angeles and trying to get out of there, but I started editing The Thief and the Cobbler Recobbled Cut properly this time. I was about 24, and I thought, this is an obscure movie, and nobody's going to watch my edit of this, but I want to do it, and I want to have it just for me. I never released that version because people started coming out of the woodwork and giving me stuff. Animators who had worked on the movie and some who hadn't. I probably redid the edit 6 times because people kept sending rare footage and a better copy of the work print, then a copy better than that, which was still pretty terrible. But I cleaned it up and I released the Recobbled Cut Mark I in April 2006, I think. But the best part of this was hearing people's stories. I released the Recobbled Cut Mark I in April 2006, I think. But the best part was hearing people's stories. All these talented artists and very nice people, Andreas Wessel-Thorhorn, Holger Lay, Tony White, Eric Goldberg, Douglas Kirk, Steve Evangelatos, and so on and so on. I realized that I was creating an archive dedicated to Richard Williams' work, and that I was writing down all these people's stories about working with Richard, because everybody had a story. I visited Alex Williams, Richard's son, at his home, and seeing Dick's work and Dick's mother's work on the wall, it was really overwhelming. I had a DVD of my Recobbled Cut, and I tried to show it to him on the DVD player. It actually cropped the sides off, but I showed him the chase scene with the checkerboards and the staircase, and his eyes lit up. He said, "You know, if we could really do this." I said, "Well, I've done it. The entire movie is on this disc." He said, "Yeah, but if we could really do it." You know, people were so supportive. After a while, the joke became that everybody was supporting this and wanted this to happen except for Richard Williams. And that's the complicated part.
Okay, so now I want to go into the 2012 documentary that I'm sure you're familiar with, Persistence of Vision by Kevin Schreck. Now, this is the documentary, of course, that went into the making of The Thief and the Cobbler, and we got all the different points of views from the different animators that have worked with Richard Williams in order to go and create it. What I would like to know is regarding your thoughts on the documentary. What did you think of Persistence of Vision? And also, did you have anything to do with the making of Persistence of Vision? Did you get involved with Kevin Schreck in order to make the documentary?
In February 2008, I was contacted by a film student at Bard College named Kevin Schreck. He'd seen the Mark II Recobbled Cut and said it was the Citizen Kane of animation, and could I send him the Mark III? He wrote me again in August 2009. He'd been an intern at DreamWorks over the summer, and he'd screened the Mark III for people when he was there. He really wanted to make his senior project a documentary about the making of The Thief and the Cobbler. Kevin Schreck then did a Kickstarter to finish his documentary about the making of The Thief and the Cobbler. This was about 2010, and it got funded for a few $1,000s, and it was successful. He made the film and played film festivals with it. Here's what I said to Kevin Schreck. Richard Williams is as much his own enemy as he was a genius. A difficult man and brilliant and complicated, and the story of the thief is so complicated because it is Richard Williams. Complicated and impossible, and there really are no heroes here, except for the dream of making a great film, which was heroic in itself. The more I researched the story, the less clear-cut it became. More and more complicated, it's tempting to portray the heroic artist killed by the sad realities of Hollywood. But as you research the story, it becomes more and more true and also more and more false in some ways. He was a man with a dream and the voice of a self-promoter, and over time he actually became as good as he said he was. Kevin's movie, Persistence of Vision, is very good. It's not the movie I would have made because I felt that too often it treats Richard as a punchline, portraying him as nutty, and that's because the people that Kevin interviewed thought of Richard as nutty. They have their own point of view about things, but they didn't see the whole picture or see Richard's side of things. And over time, I began to think that the version of this story that I really want to hear is Richard Williams' version. Even if it's not true in every detail, I wanted to hear Richard talk about the movie which dominated his life. And he didn't talk about the movie for 20 plus years. The movie that Kevin made has a lot of people's points of views in it. Now, my point of view is a little different. Kevin's movie is 100% accurate in that it depicts what the people who are interviewed think about Richard Williams and what most people think about Richard Williams in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean that they're right. It doesn't mean that I'm right either.
Very fascinating stuff. All right, so the next question that I would like to get into is going to be regarding a discussion that is still going on to this day regarding The Thief and the Cobbler, and that is related to Fred Calvert, the man who ultimately replaced Richard Williams in order to complete The Thief and the Cobbler. Now, he most certainly is a controversial figure, and some people are still talking about regarding that if he tried to save the movie, or if regarding that he didn't care and destroy it. Because on one hand, there are some people who say that he tried his best in order to go and salvage as much of the original animation as possible in order to keep Richard Williams' original vision to life. Case in point, you look into the credits and he did show some of the unused animation so that at least it is still prominent in the movie. But then on the other hand, you got another group of people that say that he's an absolute liar and that he didn't care about the movie, he didn't care about Richard Williams, and that's pretty much why he decided to go and ruin the whole thing by adding in those terrible musical numbers. So I would like to know, what is your position on this one? What do you think of Fred Calvert? Do you think that he cared about The Thief and the Cobbler, or did you think that he really didn't and he just wanted to do his job quickly? What do you think?
Fred Calvert is one of the worst animation producers. He cared about making things cheaply. He produced stuff which was too cheap for Saturday morning, even in the 70s, and stuff for Sesame Street which looked like a student did it. Fred Calvert thought Richard Williams was nuts because Richard was all about quality. Richard had really high standards, and in the 60s and 70s, animation standards outside Disney had gotten really low. It was about doing it cheaply. It wasn't about doing it right. But Richard wanted to outdo Disney, so you had a lot of people who couldn't keep up. They couldn't animate like that, and they all thought Richard was nuts. Richard wasn't nuts, he just had high standards, and he wanted to be the best, and his work got better and better because of that. Fred Calvert was kind of the worst possible person to take over for Richard Williams. He ruined that movie, and he kind of did it on purpose because he didn't appreciate it. He didn't want to make Richard's movie. He wanted to make Fred Calvert's movie. Richard Williams has said that people say to him, don't ever watch Fred Calvert's versions of the movie unless you want to jump off a bridge afterward. Warner Brothers didn't understand, and Fred Calvert didn't respect what Richard was doing. That's a mistake that most people make when they tell this story too, because Fred Calvert gave some interviews when the film was coming out where he was doing damage control, and he pretends that he hated to throw out all that amazing animation by Richard Williams, but the movie had no story and no script. It was just these disconnected scenes, and so we could only use about half of it. It's damage control. He's lying a lot because he wants to make it seem like he didn't ruin the movie. Because Richard had been talking about it as a masterpiece for so long. It had this reputation. And so Fred Calvert wanted people to think that he tried to do Richard's work as much justice as possible, but that there just wasn't a movie there to begin with, because Richard was crazy and out of control. Well, Fred Calvert wanted to make his own version of the movie. Calvert is lying when he said he had any respect for Williams' original, and it would have been a lot less work to finish the film in a more accurate way, even with inferior animation. He insisted on making a whole lot of changes. Early on, Warner's and Calvert had tried to cut the movie down in terms of length, but this is an animated film which mostly plays out in long shot. It's not like a live-action film where you have other footage and you can cut to a close-up. So I have these versions that they tried, just seeing if they could cut it down, and it's all these illegal jump cuts in the middle of scenes. It makes no sense because you can't do it. It's not even a long film. It's short. It's about 90 minutes in any incarnation. It's slowly paced, but you don't actually change that by cutting scenes. The movie is already exactly the kind of movie it wants to be, and every cut you make, every change you make, just sort of breaks it. Eventually, Miramax bought it, and they wanted to break it. Miramax was famously owned by Disney at the time, and Arabian Night purposely makes references to Aladdin and Robin Williams in the actors' very first lines in order to make it look like a cheap Aladdin ripoff. Disney released the film in 510 theaters, which is also called not releasing a film in theaters. They very purposely wanted it to fail.
Yikes! Okay! I think it is safe to say that you are not a fan of Fred Calvert. Okay, but in all seriousness though, let's take all the discussions of The Thief and the Cobbler and put them on the side, because now I want to go and focus a little bit on you, since you did mention that you are a filmmaker, you are an artist, you are an animator, you are a writer, and I want to know a little bit more about that. And also, regarding the stuff that you are working on right now, can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things that you are currently working on?
I would love to talk about my other stuff. I've kind of talked too much already. I should really wrap this up. But I've written about 12 screenplays and a couple of novels I've left a novel unfinished for too long. I've mostly been working as an illustrator. I do a lot of paintings for video game covers, and I've done conventions. I do commissions, and I'm on Patreon. Right now, I have a couple of film projects I won't talk about yet because they're not done yet, but I'll talk about them next year, I think. I did do more film restoration on the side. I've restored thousands of films, lots of Muppet stuff. I had a channel called Henson Rarities, which is shut down now, but I restored the Jim Henson Hour, Little Muppet Monsters, tons of Muppet specials. They're out there somewhere. In 2007 and 2008, I was animating lost episodes of Doctor Who from the 60s. That was a project called Who Sprites, and I did learn a lot doing it, though I wish I'd gotten to do a lot more than I did. Money and time, you know. Also in 2007, 2008, I wrote, directed, edited, and did special effects for Shamelessly She-Hulk. Like I said, that's my low-budget feature film about the Marvel Comics superheroine, the sensational She-Hulk. And it was a Marvel movie just before Marvel movies were even a thing. It had a very good cast, and it's pretty popular on YouTube, 32,000 subscribers and about 19 million views. But I never actually finished editing all that footage because it was over 55 hours of footage, and most of it had to be animated frame by frame. There's a lot of special effects animation in it, and I'm amazed to this day that I put as much work into that movie as I did. It's kind of insane. But I've gone back to it. I've been remastering it, doing new effects, and editing new scenes that people hadn't seen. I wish I had more time. You can check that out. There's a 93-minute rough cut, and I do post new scenes when I have the time, but I don't usually because I'm working on other things. You know, when I first heard about Richard Williams, he said, I can't actually show The Thief and the Cobbler until it's done, and I have a few projects that are like that right now. I can't show you till they're done. In 2020, I think.
Well, I've tried. Alright, but all jokes aside, I do have one more question, and I might as well save the biggest one for last. And I'm sure inevitably someone might ask you this question, and I feel like we might as well go and try to cap this one off once and for all to make sure we would have a definitive answer to this, and that is going back into The Thief and the Cobbler Recobbled Cut. Now, you have made several versions in the past with a Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, and the current version that we have, Mark 4. So I would like to ask, do you think there is going to be a Mark 5 in the future?
No. Unless an HD copy of the entire movie turns up, maybe. That's a 35mm print of A Moment in Time, Arabian Night, or The Princess and the Cobbler. But I'm never doing all that work over again. I actually stopped editing the Recobbled Cut on purpose at the end of 2013. I was taking dirt and splices out frame by frame by frame, and I'd been doing it for 2 or 3 years, and there was just a point where I needed to stop. It was as good as it needed to be, or that anyone would notice, and I needed to move on with my life like I have a life. I know that I was able to rehabilitate the movie's place in animation history, because Arabian Night was a joke, and now it's not. Now Richard talks about it again, and he shows the work print, so I think I did something good.
Okay, good to know, but that's pretty much all the questions that I have. So Garrett, I would like to say thank you so much for doing this. It really was a pleasure talking to you here.
But thank you for having me, Matt. Hopefully, I know this is long, and I went on for a bit. I'm very hot and sweaty right now, and sunburnt, but I hope that was interesting to anybody. I know I did go on a bit. And thank you to people out there who care about The Thief and the Cobbler, who care about this film. Thank you for your support over the years, and I'm sure Richard Williams appreciates it too. Thank you, and I hope you have a good day, rest of your summer.
Yes, and also I would like to say thank you guys for watching this interview. It definitely was a lot of fun. So once again, I want to give a major thanks to Garrett Gilchrist, and don't forget to go and follow him on social media. I will go and provide the links. And with that said, I want to say once again, thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, see you later, dudes!